Uh, Thank you for coming. Great many of you have been around before when I've done these sessions. And you know I normally do them extemporaneously. But I was a little apprehensive about this topic today, so for a rare chance, I have made some notes, which I hope will keep me on track. And I do apologize for holding off questions until I've gotten through it, just to make sure I can keep the flow that I want of what's going on. The topic that Gail gave me to work on today was finding opportunity at the international marketplace. And that caused me to first think about what are the needs? What drives this? What do you need to find opportunity? Stability. Economic growth follows stability, and it flees from disorder and strife. So look for where there is stability, and frankly, for business purposes, that matters more than the form of government that's there in the process. Capital availability to support, and what kind of investment climate do you find in those very many different markets that are out there? What's the tax climate? I would jump to one quick conclusion for you. I had the privilege of serving on a large number of multinational corporate boards over 19, 20 years till I aged out. I never saw a sound decision made purely on the basis of taxes. And I saw far too many opportunities where decisions were made because it was going to be tax advantageous. And if there really wasn't a solid business purpose underneath it, it turned out to be a bad outcome. Capable workforce. Education system that produces a capable workforce. And finally, the rule of law. If there are clear rules, regulations, law, then it's much easier to go conduct business. Where that does not exist, suddenly fears of protection of intellectual property, other things rise to interfere and sometimes prevent good economic growth. Where are the disruptors to watch for and therefore to be very cautious about proceeding for business activity? Strife, from wars to terrorism. They disrupt and in some cases destroy business opportunities. One that I'm still coming to grips with, the digital transformation. Fundamental ways that doing business is changing not only in our own country but globally. I simply note that John mentioned all the traffic with the Friday after Thanksgiving growing to be probably the worst day. And suddenly this year, between that Friday and also this past Monday, there was almost more business done online than by people getting in the traffic queues and in the stores. And that's true globally. Uncertainty. Business does not prosper in an era of uncertainty. And I'll come back to this point as I do my geographic spin. Where there is uncertainty, whether it's from regulatory approaches or from potential involvement in strife, wars, it is very unfavorable to business climate. Fluctuating commodity prices right now. It may not be a long-term trend, but certainly fluctuating commodity prices are having a very significant impact on business opportunities globally as we speak. I'm going to shift from these overarching ones to, I'm not quite ready to shift. What's out there on the horizon? Not yet here, but clearly worrisome to me. At the top of that is the diverging paths of the central banks. We are depending on what the jobs notice is on Friday, we're probably going to venture in mid-December to a 1/4 point rise in interest rates. First rise in 9 years. The opposite direction in the European Central Bank, getting ready to further reduce rates. And we're seeing in Japan and China sudden fluctuations in this case. It's not clear to me yet what impact these diverging paths are going to have on overall economic growth and stability. Certainly, the volatile currency exchange rates are having very significant impact. You can have great success in sales, and then you do your currency translation, and you suddenly discover that the profits have vanished in substantial numbers. And I don't know what's going to come out of Paris and the current focus on global warming, but I have substantial worries that I don't see a component of the discussions that looks at what's the impact on business, what's the impact on economic growth or activity from all these proposed changes, and how will that impact, yes, on global warming, but we don't know what long-term impact that will have. What impact it will have on economic growth we can measure much more quickly and directly. Let me shift to a geographic look at these challenges and start comfortably with North America. Election in Canada brought the Liberals back to power. Young Mr. Trudeau. It'll be interesting to see if he proves to be as colorful as his father was. He's moving a little more cautiously than his father did and taking over, about making change. He appears to still be supportive of strong economic growth, including in their energy industry in the process. In the U.S., the economy is growing, but it's growing slowly. 2% will not do the job we need over the long term. It needs to be back up to a robust 3.5% to be comfortable about dealing with job growth, wage increase, the rest of it. At this point, that's not visible. And I would make the case to you that at least some of that is uncertainty. I was disappointed that this many years into the recovery, capital expenditures by industry are in fact down, particularly this year. And trying to understand why would they be down? It's uncertainty. Regulatory environment, particularly in that process. We can measure with certainty the impact of regulatory change. With a great interest in having long-term impact on global warming, EPA regulations have produced, in the last 4 years, loss of 10,000 jobs in West Virginia, one of the most impoverished states in the country. So that's a measurable outcome of the regulatory environment. There will be a long time before we learn, or our grandchildren learn, whether that also contributed over the long term to better outcomes from global warming. Mexico. Narcotic fuel violence is still there, not from Mexican consumption, from U.S. consumption, but it's getting the drugs to market in the U.S. There has been substantial change, legislative change, over the last 2.5 years under President Nieto. He surprised a lot of us by using the period between election in July and taking office on the 1st of December to work with the opposition parties to come to some fundamental agreements on major regulatory changes, legislative changes, including constitutional change to permit foreign investment in the oil business. Too soon yet to know how it's going to pay off, because it's not enough to get the legislation. It's how you execute the programs afterwards that make the ultimate difference. But what is clear, there is an improving manufacturing climate in Mexico. They're becoming an attractive place for things that previously were going off to Asia, to China, elsewhere, now coming back much closer to the U.S. market in Mexico. What ties the three countries together beyond our day-to-day trade operations? It's that prospect that North America could not only be energy independent, but exporting. Mexico and Canada both export to us now, but with the success of shale and the rest, we were on the verge of becoming, if we got rid of legislation that prohibits export, of having the first major impact on unfavorable balance payments in my adult lifetime. Now, the Saudis saw a threat to their dominance, the energy market, with U.S. shale production. So they've been willing to lower their lifestyle slightly to go down to $50 a barrel as opposed to $100 a barrel. And it has indeed dramatically impacted on drilling for new energy sources. I think what would change that would be Congress moving forward the legislation and hopefully the President signing it to get rid of the ban on export of oil and gas. That would give a surge at the marketplace, helpful on price. John talked about the traffic. I do enjoy the cheaper price I'm paying for while I'm idling in that traffic in the process. So it would probably go back up if my hope to get the export ban lifted, but it's worth the offset for what it would do for the countries of balanced payments. Central America, not a place I would recommend to you at this point to look for major expansion. There are pockets that are good, but if you look at the region collectively, gang violence is a significant factor in so many of the countries. And what's particularly sad, a lot of those gangs were originally formed in U.S. prisons. And when they let out and they were deported back, and they just simply took what they learned to do and have expanded it. It's behind much of the illegal immigration we see coming out of Central America, trying to get to the U.S. Lack of stability and corruption in government. Go to the great continent of South America, and you look first at Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, elected primarily on anti-U.S. platforms, governing on those anti-U.S. approaches. They're not a friendly place for the U.S. to go undertake business opportunities. The opposite side of that coin, Colombia, Peru, Chile, and maybe now even Argentina. Election Sunday week ago, the opposition candidate squeaked in, not a very large majority, but he was a proven entity already from being president of the most successful soccer club in Argentina, and then the very successful mayor of Buenos Aires. And most of all, he's not a Peronista. So this is the first time in a very long time that we've seen the possibility of a major change in the business climate in Argentina. And if that's followed up with specific changes to facilitate doing business, Argentina may be a place that we want to look at for some business expansion. Chile is still the best place. It's expensive, but again, rule of law, free market economics. The great surprise and disappointment to me is Brazil. 14 years ago, Brazil elected a far-left Workers' Party leader, Lula da Silva, on his fourth try. and I was wringing my hands about what was going to happen to Brazil. He turned out to be a more effective implementer of free market economic policies than his three conservative predecessors, and the Brazilian economy took off. And the currency value soared. And then he got through his 8 years, elected to abide by the constitutional limit, got his chief of staff elected, first woman president of Brazil. Good first 2 years, and then things began to go south. She did manage to get reelected in a runoff campaign, but the economy was continuing to deteriorate. And when you stand back and say, what happened to Brazil? It had a very solid manufacturing economy. Most of those sales were to the U.S. and to its surrounding countries, particularly in Mercosur, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil. As the currency went up and their principal trading partner became China, China wasn't interested in the manufactured products. They wanted the raw materials, and they wanted agricultural products, and bought them in large numbers, enough that even limits were put on what they could own in the agricultural space. And suddenly Brazil found it had priced itself out of its local markets in the process. And when the Chinese economy began to slump and they no longer wanted to buy the raw materials and agricultural impact, Brazil went from growing 5.5–6% to negative growth now this year in the process. Add on top of that corruption. They are racked at this point in time by the biggest corruption scandals in their history. The state-owned oil company had been used as a piggy bank to fund not only the financial parties, but to buy votes regularly in the Congress. And it's steadily spreading. Just this past week, the head of the largest investment bank was arrested for his role in helping flow the corruption through. And the ramifications of that are still going. A lead senator elected a week ago. There are major political figures actually on trial before the courts that have always been immune to prosecution in the past. How this is going to shake out is not clear. But what is clear, it has made Brazil an unattractive place to try to go do business in the short term. In looking across the South Atlantic, the great continent of Africa, and first focusing south of the Sahara, the major investor in Africa is China. They have built infrastructure in a great many of the countries. They've left some unhappiness because much of the construction work was done by Chinese laborers, not by local natives having been trained. Nonetheless, if you stand back and look at a decade long, hard to measure, almost impossible month by month, even hard year by year. But if you take a 10-year look, from the 90s to there was a slight growth. First decade of this century, 1.5% broadly growth. That's continuing halfway into this decade. So that says a significant part of that vast population are better off than they were 20 years ago. It's also the one place where population continue to explode. While in most of the rest of the world, we see declining population rates, particularly in the modern industrial companies. In China, in Africa, it's still booming, which means their needs for economic growth are even greater. Country lines were drawn by the colonial powers not to be able to govern, but to be able to get the raw materials that colonial power wanted to have. As a result, no regard for tribes, ethnicity, religions. A lot of them are just hard to govern in the process. Ghana is one of the brighter ones. There are only two major tribes there. good raw materials, discovery of oil offshore, a promising place to try. Substantial surprise to me was Rwanda. Again, recipient of a lot of aid from China. A president that is not a liberal Democrat. He's much more in the spirit of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. We're coming up to the point of whether he can stay in power. Does he have to change the Constitution in the process? But the reality is it's not 2 decades yet from the genocide. He has done an amazing job, at least on the surface, of healing. He won't let people talk about what tribe they were from. They are natives of Rwanda, not of a tribe. Every Friday, you go out to clean. Doesn't matter what your status is in government, in business, in society. Friday is for cleaning in the process. So again, it's reminiscent of Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew. But there are also significant programs to teach young women how to be entrepreneurs and aim particularly at the telecommunications industry and the not-for-profit. So as a place to think about investing, as long as they can keep the political stability, Rwanda stands out. And while there is corruption, it's at a much lower scale than you see in a good many of the other African countries. Go north of the Sahara, and this is where the so-called Arab Spring began and had its greatest impact. We're now 4 years past that start date. Morocco, young king, has governed with some foresight. He has kept expectations within bounds of what he was prepared to permit, but there is a greater role by the popular vote. He selects the prime minister from the party that got the most vote. The prime minister recognizes there are limits on how far he can go. Economic growth is picking up. It's not as great as it should be. But to this point, cross fingers, Morocco has avoided the kinds of terrorist attacks that we see in so much of the rest of West and North Africa. Algeria is a big unknown. Government lost an election a decade ago and refused to hand over the government, tightened the reins. But its leadership is 10 years older, infirm. So it's a place to watch. How do they transition to the next generation of leaders? And do they manage to keep stability, or does it turn toward the chaotic state of some of the other countries? Egypt went through a dramatic shift. The overthrow of Mubarak, who'd stayed too long, and the banning of his political party meant that the only organized political entity was the Muslim Brotherhood. And you held elections, and surprise, surprise, they won. And then elected a president who had no interest in collaboratively sharing power. And so the demonstrators came back to the streets. Why? Because they came the first time for economic reasons, not demanding democracy as we know it. And they came back to the streets because they still saw no gains on the economic side. Army moved again. Marshal Sisi then stepped in and ran for election. He is there. We've held him out at arm's length because he overthrew elected government and took power. But the reality is he has returned stability to Egypt, and there are beginning to be signs of economic growth. Got a long way to go in the process. It is not a democracy, will not be a democracy as we think about it. But in turn, if you go back to what caused the people to come out in the first place, economic growth, it was stability they needed foremost. Tunisia, where it started, is the one example of first going to an Islamist government, and when that wasn't working, they went to a collaborative arrangement, 3 different parties involved. That's coming along reasonably well, but the challenge is terrorism. And the terrorism has been aimed primarily at the tourist industry, which is absolutely critical for the Tunisian economy to pick up. And now most recently, a couple of weeks ago, a terrorist attack on the presidential guards, traveling, 12 of them killed, in essence. That's led to a declaration of emergency rule, setting back the democracy gains. But again, the reality is, if they're going to grow, they need stability in the process. And that takes me finally to Libya. Gaddafi was overthrown. He was a bad guy, ran a tough government, but there was no plan of what to do after he was overthrown. And you end up with chaos. And if you've been tracking the papers, probably the most alarming part, Sirte on the coast is the new haven for ISIS. And ISIS leaders in Syria and Iraq, afraid they may be killed by the drone strikes, are moving to Sirte to run the operations from there. Not giving up land, but moving to what they presume is safe haven. So Libya is becoming more and more a safe haven for the largest single terrorist challenge that we face. And that leads me to Europe. The European Union is trying to come to grips with the largest wave of migration that we've seen since the end of World War II. They hadn't thought through, anticipated anything like it. They're having difficulty with it. The terrorists ran a brilliant gamut. I absolutely missed it when it started. And that was taking someone who was going to be a suicide bomber in France and running him with the refugees into Greece, get fingerprinted on his papers, disappearing, blowing himself up outside the stadium in Paris. Fingerprints demonstrate, terrorists who came through with refugees. And for the whole continent, suddenly, instead of looking at this wave of economic refugees, political refugees, with compassion, now there's that concern. Are there terrorists hidden into those ranks in the process? As she does on most issues in Europe, Mrs. Merkel was the leader in trying to find a compassionate approach to deal with them. There are almost 1 million of those refugees that have come into Germany. They had, in fact, a labor shortage. So their ability to train and use them and offer them economic opportunity, probably better than anywhere else except possibly Sweden on much smaller scale. But she's run into real troubles within her own political base. And this could end up bringing to an abrupt earlier tenure, end of Mrs. Merkel's tenure. She's been the most dramatic leader in Europe since Margaret Thatcher, who also suddenly lost her popularity, you may recall, was lost over proposing a poll tax in the process, vastly unpopular. It could turn out that Mrs. Merkel's view of compassion for the vast migration may turn out to be her undoing. I hope that one's not where it's going to go. In looking, I can't avoid it, so let me go deal with the Middle East. Israel's economy continues to boom. It's an interesting transition over the last 15 years of an absolute boom based on technology. Everybody has to do military service. And they reached out to take the brightest of the graduates and put them in a couple of units that support their signals intelligence activity. They worked together, and then they finished their service, and they went out and formed companies together. And they've taken off in the process. Israel is no longer dependent in any way, shape, or form on the aid they get from us. Access to military hardware is important, but they could drop the couple of billion a year economic aid with no significant impact on that booming economy. But they need stability. And this is where the issue with the Palestinians in trying to reach agreement. I won't dwell on this one, simply to note, to have any prospect of a political settlement between Israel and the Palestinians, you need leaders on both sides who want a solution at the same time and can deliver their constituencies. And Mr. Netanyahu is not interested, and President Abbas can't deliver Hamas in Gaza, and not absolutely clear to me he could even deliver the West Bank in the process. So no near-term progress there. Arabian Peninsula. Just age and health have led us into fairly rapid successions in Saudi Arabia. King Abdullah was succeeded by his brother, Prince Salman, who'd been the governor of Riyadh before becoming the crown prince. Probably the best we could have hoped for of a leader favorably oriented toward the U.S., not an admirer of the current U.S. administration in the process, whom he alleges that its indecision is the point he keeps coming back to. He has begun the process of transition to the next generation and took the son of his brother, the former Minister of Interior and Crown Prince type, and made him the Crown Prince. He's broadly respected in the West, but he took his own son, 32 years old, and made him Deputy Crown Prince, Minister of Defense. He's in charge of the operation in Yemen, where they brought military forces from a number of countries, and now this last week we've learned they've also hired mercenaries from Colombia to go in to fight. But they're, at this point, it looks like that they're stalled in the process. The only group that seems to have prospered from the ongoing fight between the Shia and the Sunni in Yemen are al-Qaeda. And that al-Qaeda offshoot remains focused on trying to bring terror directly to the U.S. Whether there's going to be disruption within the royal family over the succession is a big question mark for me. I noted that they've gone out to float $1 billion debt. First time they carried no debt. That's the impact of continuing to produce maximum level at just $50 a barrel and not wanting to reduce the lifestyle of the large royal family in the process. But we're headed toward a crunch point on that issue, whether it's the next year or the next year after. Salman's health is not good. And when it comes to succession, there is the point to worry. Excuse me. Iran. There is a nuclear agreement. They're proceeding toward complying with the requirements to implement it. And when they get a little further along, we reduce $150 billion that has been frozen back into their hands. For those optimists who thought somehow reaching this agreement would lead to warmer relations with Iran and wanting to do business with us, the Ayatollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards who are in charge have made it very clear that there will not be any warming. So you see a flood of aircraft headed in from Western Europe, from Russia, from China, looking to do business when Iran has that $150 billion to dispose. It will not be a climate where U.S. business will be welcome or favored in the process. And finally, Iraq, Syria, ISIS. We're at a point now where boundaries that were put in place after World War I may be about to be undone permanently in the process. Whether Iraq can stay together as a country is a big question mark. There's still great oil wealth. They're pumping oil at this point at a level almost parallel to Saudi Arabia. So a lot of money is flowing in. Hard to tell where it's going. Life doesn't seem to be getting better for the average Iraqi in this process. Best business climate is up in the northeast, in the Kurdish area. And they're also the ones that have demonstrated the will to fight if they're given the capability. But the reality is that much of the Sunni area is still under the occupation of ISIS, and it's a brutal occupation on an ongoing basis in the process. But even as unhappy as the Sunnis under occupation are, they're reluctant to sign up with an Iraqi government that they believe is not only Shia-dominated, but hostile toward their own interest. And Iran continues to be a major player in the process. So whether you end up with a cohesive Iraq or three different countries, it's not going to play out this year, but over the next 2 or 3 years, it could. In Syria, we see a lot of movement with Mr. Putin having decided to get involved. The general media interpretation was that he wanted to hold up Assad. His primary motivation is that there are more than 2,000 Chechens fighting with ISIS. And he concluded he would rather fight them in Syria and Iraq than back in Russia in the process. And his ability to do that requires the Syrian army as the ground force, supported by Russian commandos, the same ones that trained in the Ukraine and Crimea, and they're already in Syria in the process. So we're moving towards some kind of a political shuffle. It may take the form of the U.S. organizing the coalition that moves against ISIS in Iraq, and Russia organizing the coalition, along with France, that moves against ISIS in Syria. ISIS is the number one threat at this point, and they've demonstrated in Paris and Beirut, the Russian airliner, the extent to which they are prepared to export violence globally, and we may see more of that coming out of Libya. But you won't get ISIS suppressed unless there are coalitions that move. Why is that important to us? Their success in recruiting, including in this country, has come from the prospect that they're winning. Disaffected youngsters seeing what they think is a winning entity and wanting to be part of it. And if they are visibly losing, they will lose a lot of that attractiveness that's now fueled the recruiting. We haven't come up with any other way to defeat their success at recruiting on the internet. You know, I began looking at this problem 20 years ago. We were worried about al-Qaeda recruiting at the mosques. Very little recruiting takes place now at the mosques. It's almost all done online. Very sophisticated. So back to the earlier comments about digital revolution, even the terrorists have learned the power of the digital opportunity to access and gain adherence to their cause. Finally, Turkey. Mr. Erdogan is not a Democrat. He's gotten elected at the ballot box. He's more concerned about holding on to power. He lost an election, lost a majority, stalled on putting up a government for 4 months, called another election, and they had a lot of violence, explosions, all blamed on the pro-Kurdish group, and sure enough, the election results flowed in his favor. And he's moving toward trying to move power to the presidency. He'd served his maximum terms as prime minister, so he got elected to the presidency. Now he's trying to pull all the power there. His decision to shoot down the Russian fighter bomber is an intriguing one to me. What purpose? That was certainly not the first violation in the process. And it turns out, while they were allegedly warning, they weren't even on the same radio channels to communicate with the aircraft that were there. But what he did with that action was to halt momentum toward Russia coming together with the West on cracking down on ISIS in the process. So we got this interesting perspective of two powerful, arrogant leaders in Erdogan and Putin who are now in a head-on clash disagreement. But Turkey is a member of NATO. And so that does impact all of us in the prospect how it plays out. I'd remind you of Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all in the process. Let me hasten along on this process. Germany remains the best performing economy in Europe. It had gone through a slowdown last year. Looks like it's picking back up. It is the economy that drags along the rest of Europe. France was not all that far behind. I fear that the attacks in Paris, the impact on the tourist industry, the rest, will disrupt, and all of the emergency procedures, because the fear of further strikes is real. It's not imaginary in the process. And we see also the prospect that attacks were planned in Belgium. As you look at the southern tier, Spain had appeared to be surging back. They're now about to be saddled with a huge bankruptcy for the largest producer of solar power, notwithstanding the vast subsidies for solar power. And that's going to ripple through the Spanish economy. This may be the place to watch when we see new parties. And they've tended to be either on the far right or the far left. There's a new phenomenon in Spain of a party in the middle, attracting a lot of attention. Not clear whether it's going to develop. It would be nice to see a centrist effort come to power in one of those countries as a model for the others. Portugal, Italy, Greece all remain in fragile economic status. Italy's somewhat better off than it was 2 years ago. Russia under Mr. Putin, he remains enormously popular at home. There's a steady flow every day of news on their successes in Syria and their targets. And again, he hasn't just gone after ISIS, because there are substantial number of Central Asian people fighting with the rebels who've been holding Aleppo et al. So when he goes after the Turkmen, this has Turkey in mind as much as it does the rest. Very complex problems to sort through. At $50 a barrel, their economy is hurting in the process. Clearly, any surge back would be helpful, but there's no real threat to his political position. He'll come up for re-election again in 2018, and he'll win another 6 years. So we can expect as a minimum that we have Mr. Putin to deal with till at least 2024. And we will have had elections in 2016, 2020, 2024. Going to Asia, finally. The decision to keep support forces in Afghanistan, both U.S. and other NATO countries, now out to 2017. Painful decision for the president, who had wanted to be able to retire, that he had ended wars in the process. whether the Afghan military has the will to fight and the capability without direct U.S. air support is a huge question. There's a new effort just underway to try to again get the Taliban and the Afghan government to talk peace. I'm not very optimistic. It'd be wonderful if it could work. India is a big factor watching, and the Pakistan-India rivalry plays on this. Obviously, the potential hugely dominant power is India. Mr. Modi has his hands full in trying to get the Indian economy moving. Just numbers. There are over 300,000 people, almost our entire population, living in poverty levels still in India without regular access to electric power. I'm old enough to remember when the Rural Electrification Agency brought electric power to rural Texas, and the dramatic change that brought from having to study by kerosene lamps to electric lights, and what that meant ultimately in the surge for the economy. When I think about 300 million people without electric power in the process and poverty line, and where do they get the electric power they get now? Over 60% of it is coal-fired. So go back to Paris and the climate talks and the impact on potential long-term impact on global warming and ice melting toward can you do anything to bring 300 million people out of poverty and improve their lives. And I hope somewhere that eventually gets into the debate. Southeast Asia, doing well. ASEAN has worked for a long time. It's probably the most successful of the long-term trade agreements in the process. I came to the private sector 33 years ago. Came to Austin to compete with the Japanese. Japanese government had been growing 10% a year for 25 years. They were buying property all over the U.S. They were competing. We were unfavorably competing with them. Quality control of automobiles on. And then the property bubble burst. And they've gone into now approaching 20 years of succeeding recessions, deflation. Mr. Abe, after that led to 5 different prime ministers from opposition parties, never lasting longer than a year. LDP got back into power. Mr. Abe is a nationalist. Right now, he's snuggling close to the U.S. and a security treaty and looking to expand collaboration with the U.S. And as long as he concludes we're a reliable ally, that'll continue. But lest Russia go into Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and we don't act, and what will be Mr. Abe's judgment about the ability to rely on U.S. nuclear guarantees. And that also transfers into the Korean Peninsula, because South Korea has some of those same concerns. North Korea remains one of the most erratic places. And I'm not sure anybody has influence there. China had a lot of influence, and they still have the flow of petroleum products as a lever they could play. President Xi in China has been very direct that he wants to see a non-nuclear Korean Peninsula. But hard for me to understand what would motivate the young, dear leader to give up his burgeoning nuclear capability if we've already agreed in Iran to move from prohibiting proliferation to managing proliferation. We just wait 10 years to see it happen. Why should he give up his leverage at this point? And that does take me finally to China. Second largest economy. Let me detour before I get there. We hear so much condemnation of the role the U.S. plays in the outside world, particularly with the younger generation in this country. And you do look at the chaos in Iraq and in Libya and the rest. I would simply remind this audience that we fought a world war, but in that process, we planned to rebuild the defeated countries. And we trained the people to go in and do that, first to establish order, then to provide vital services and food, and then local governments, and then regional governments, and finally national governments. Strong, functioning democracies, the third and fourth largest economies in the world. And it took 6 years to do it in both cases. And the idea that you can go topple a despot that you don't like, human rights, whatever reasons, and not plan a 6-year commitment of what you're going to do afterwards is pure folly, in my view. Finally, on China. President Xi carefully planned for 5 years his ascent to power. He was the vice president, the vice chairman of the military commission, president of the Central Military School, head of the Central Party Secretariat. He recognized that the greatest threat to Communist Party sustained control of China was corruption. He didn't say much about it till he got in office. And then he set out with a very carefully structured crackdown. When I was out there for the first time, the U.S. government would let me go as a tourist back in 2005. Everywhere I went, the wonderful guys, but they'd talk about the one-child policy, who was going to take care of the grandparents, and corruption. They catch the little guys, never the big ones. Well, Xi Jinping has fundamentally changed that. He has gone after them all across the energy industry. Hard to do business in the energy industry now in China because there's so much uncertainty across the remaining leadership. How far down does the corruption go? That fled into the public security apparatus. They spent more money on public security than they did on the armed forces, PLA. That leadership has been, now much of them in jail. They'd come up out of the energy industry to run it. The military, two major 4 stars who were on the Central Military Commission are in jail. They were selling promotions. If you wanted to get promoted to 1 star, you had to pay off to get there. And it's continuing to go on now. They are reorganizing the country. They appeared to have studied what Putin did when he took over in 2000 in Russia. He went from 189 separate administrators to 7 regions, and he appointed those leaders. And Xi Jinping appears to be headed toward that same restructuring, both in the PLA and in the governance structure. He is determined the Communist Party will govern China, no weakening there, and anything that appears to threaten that, including the digital revolution, is under intense scrutiny and observation. There is a great entrepreneurial spirit. Deng Xiaoping unleashed it. There are now more billionaires in China than there are in the U.S. in the process. There's a pretty conscious display of that wealth. But there are about 600 million Chinese who have benefited from the surge. And there's another close to 500 million who have not in the process. And this regime had intended to bring in another 300 billion of those into the improving economy on the basic premise, as long as the middle class was expanding, they'd be willing to stay out of politics. 3 decades of growth in the 10% area, Then it fell off to 9% 2 years ago, and I'm sorry, 3 years ago, 8% 2 years ago, 7.5% down to maybe 7% this year, probably at best in the high sixes next year. That's still, for that scale economy, that's a lot of growth. But it will not produce the continued expansion of middle class that you need if you are going to be sure they're willing to stay out of politics. When's the big next decision point? 2017. That's when, of the current 7 members of the Standing Committee, 5 of them will reach the 65-year retirement age in 2017. I don't expect to see all 5 of them retire, because one of those is the guy who runs the whole rectification campaign, the anti-corruption campaign. I don't see Xi being willing to hand that off while it's still a major factor, both in getting rid of a real problem and consolidating his own power. But we'll see a number of others pop up at that point in time. His term runs on out to 2022. And just as I reminded you on President Putin, we've got 2 elections in this case before he ends his term. Totally different cultures, totally different political systems, some natural entrepreneurial instincts and talent. The challenge is to find areas where we can collaborate. What I say to them, we will never be allies. We don't have to be enemies. We will always be competitors. To what degree can we be friendly competitors, and where not friendly, can we build fences around to limit how adversarial it becomes? As a place to do business, I have to give you an ambiguous mark at this point. They're very slow at making decisions in the process. Plus, they've got one extra problem. So much of that wealth that was amassed in the great run-up since '78, a lot of it from corruption, a lot more from favoritism, probably more from favoritism than corruption. But the government has put very tight controls on moving money out of China. Primary purpose, to find the dirty money, they refer to it, going out. But it said for businesses who want to invest in the U.S., individuals who want to invest, the challenge for them is how much money can they get clearance to move out. So as they approach and they want to go make major purchases, if they can do it on trading stock and don't have to spend cash, approval to go. But if it's to go put money to work in this country, which many Chinese would like to do, their challenge is getting approval of Ministry of Defense. Now, this has been a long rundown, but we've got about 20 minutes till you're supposed to be free to leave. So let me stop and throw the floor open for questions. Who'd like to get it started?
Can you comment on the recent decision by the IMF to give the okay to the Chinese yuan joining the basket of international currencies,
Right.
and the impact that will have on money moving into China to take advantage of the eventuality that there could be a move to establish the yuan as one of the reserve currencies, and to many concerned U.S. banking individuals, possibly replacing the U.S. dollar as a worldwide reserve currency.
Yeah. The first part is a valid, but the second one I don't buy as a valid concern. Moving, given the size of that economy and its power, moving its currency, as long as they remove the restrictions that were manipulating the exchange rate. As long as they committed to do that, then moving them into the basket and having them next August become a reserve currency, I view as a plus, both for their integration with the global economy, and it's also easier. It's going to be interesting to see how Saudi Arabia reacts. They're going to be willing to handle all the oil sales instead of dollars in renminbi. But it ties them further into the economies of the rest of the world in the process. We already compete successfully, maybe too successfully right now, against the euro, the yen, the pound. I'm not worried at all about our ability to compete with the yuan, renminbi, over the long term. I came to the private sector 33 years ago, was to compete with the Japanese. And what we learned was the real way to compete was run faster, bring back higher quality to what we produced, and get it to market faster. And that's what the specific downturn of their own economy helped in that case. I feel the same way about China in the process. Don't be afraid of competing. Hone how well you compete in the process. And a currency that's convertible actually makes it easier to do that over the long term. So the ability, they hold on the order, it's down a little bit right now, but it's close to $1.2 trillion of our debt. Anything that sabotages the dollar, its value, hits directly on those holdings. So they've got a lot of reasons, and there's no place they can go readily sell off that debt without having huge impact. They've drawn it down about $100 billion this year to invest in other, including their own internal efforts to shuffle, to move from being totally an export market to being one that also has a significantly larger domestic marketplace. So they had to make the concession that they would relax the controls on the yuan and let it float. The big key is to watch, do they really comply with that? And that's going to be the thing. But hopefully the IMF will take the lead so it isn't just a U.S. issue of whether or not they manage it. Yes, sir.
You haven't said anything about Cuba yet. And interestingly, our governor has gone to Cuba to, I guess, mainly agriculturally try to increase relations. What's your view of Cuba?
My views on Cuba have been controversial for a long time. I believe we should have canceled the embargo the day the Soviet Union fell apart. It had passed its utility at that stage. And the reason I wanted to see it go was I wanted to see encouraging U.S. investment in Cuba, in infrastructure, in the rest, so that we had some influence inside Cuba in the process. Now, I would also note for you, I was totally wrong on what was going to happen on the political side. I fearlessly forecast Fidel would rule until he died. When he died, his brother Raul would take over. It wouldn't last long. Well, Fidel becomes seriously ill, and he handed over power. And what I totally missed was that Raul had spent the previous decade sending bright young colonels out to look at how other countries were managing their economies. So you had a very slow, very gradual lessening. You no longer have to have a black market to sell fruit and vegetables house to house. You can have open markets. It's still an impoverished economy in many ways in the process. We will be better off, and so will the Cuban people, if we accelerate getting rid of the embargo and encourage a potential great agricultural market for the U.S. in the process. And, we deal with communist governments around the rest of the world. Why are we afraid to do it on that small island? The fear earlier was when the Soviets were using it as a staging base and a huge intelligence collection base in the process. With that retreated with the collapse of the Soviet Union, I did not understand I understood why the control state votes in Florida and New Jersey. But in 2008, they voted for President Obama. In 2012, they voted for his reelection. So I don't understand why he waited 6 years to finally move on recognition and lowering the economy. Yes, sir.
Public pension plans in the United States, an example would be the Texas teacher retirement system, our largest state system, have a diversity of assets that include international assets. They're coming under increasing criticism for being in that area or investing as much as they are. On the actuarial side, there's even discussion of there should be limits placed on what percent of assets they can invest in international. Your comment on that?
I served for about 20 years on a number of large multinational corporate boards. And I usually ended up chairing the compensation committee and serving on the finance committee, the rest, looking at pension obligations and where you had it invested. As a general thumb rule, I was comfortable with 10% in the international market space. Got a little apprehensive when it got anywhere over 15%. I've been a trustee of Caltech for 26 years now. Keep re-electing me. And I don't serve on the investment committee, but I watch their dispersal. They do not do that higher percentage on international. On the other hand, they do a much higher percent on alternative investments than most of it. I was in a mode where you did 55, 60% equities and 25, 30% fixed income, and then a little dabble of real estate. And then out of that equities, you do 10% or so international. In this turbulent world we're in right now, I'll be honest to tell you, I've pulled back my enthusiasm on investing in the European environment because of the incentive. Still attracted to Asia as a place to invest at this time. For those who got through a lot younger than I am, with a long viewpoint, there may be some good opportunities in Africa. I'm just not closely enough acquainted with it, but there's such a base of raw materials, natural resources to exploit. Clearly going to be booming populations, which says there are all kinds of opportunities that follow that. The issue really is, are you going to take the measures, provision of electricity, other things that bring up the level? And if that occurs, then I would be more inclined to look at some investments in Africa. Chile, obviously, you've already gotten a signal I like.
Can you speak to data security and the impact on international commerce in this new era of disruption? And
as a rule, let me get you to think about data security in 5 different slices. The hacker, usually high testosterone young male, proving they can break into something. Mischief. It's when they get together as a group, a gang, that gets to be dangerous. Second slice, disaffected employee. Mr. Snowden proved that case, unfortunately. A third slice are the criminal elements, focused primarily on the financial institutions. They're very good at it. Despite of a lot of money spent across that financial networks, they still are vulnerable and are hit frequently. Fourth slice is the nation state. Most sophisticated are the Soviets, the Russians. Chinese are the largest. But a rule of thumb, every country that has state-owned enterprises uses digital collection to support the competition of their own companies at the international marketplace. Finally, the terrorist. As I look at, I see their skill in recruiting. I look at the probing of our electric grid, probing of the air control system, and I worry, is that a nation state thinking about what they do in event of hostilities, or is that a terrorist group looking to see how they could dismantle us? The government has done a good job, not a great job, on the intelligence world and the defense world. We saw with OPM how little protection there's been for the rest of government. Private sector, not a lot better. One of the great scrambles over this next decade is going to be talent to work on that problem in industry and inside the government as well. I'm comfortable that a lot of things you can do in a defensive posture. I get uncomfortable when I hear talk about an offensive policy. How do you create the rules? What are the rules of engagement? And we are more vulnerable to that than most other countries. So I'm pretty cautious on the idea of offensive approaches to the cyber problem. Del? Proper for the last one to go to Del.
Oh, thank you very much, Admiral. You're one of the few people that could possibly understand the question. I may not be able to pose real well, but I will try. I see a lot of program plans at the federal government agencies that are more or less independent of requirements from industry. So there's an increasing separation of industrial needs and government policy, if you wish, or government funding. Then you look at the Brussels program and you get more and more structure. Less and less independent activity, organic activity. Our young people are now being forced to follow these edicts or whatever else you might describe them. So the organic processes we used to have between Europe and the United States are being diminished, and this imbalances tend to put us in a very weak position when we're really in competition. I wonder if you would like to respond to that.
We tend to go in cycles for very good reasons. We went into a major effort early last century to deal with monopolies, antitrust, and to deal with pitiful protection of food supplies and things. And we overshot and then began to ease back a bit. This latest surge, it's been going on for about 20 years, and it shows no sign of slackening at this point in time. It's sort of the government knows best, and therefore that sort of looking for an area to regulate. I note the number of students that we attract seem to have their career choice as regulatory organizations. They see that as a growth area in the process. And my problem, as you will have heard earlier in my conversations on the whole issue on global warming, is where do you find the balance? Where do you do the test? We have to go through all kinds of environmental procedures before you can build on a process. Where do we do that comparable test for the impact on jobs, on the economy, before we apply additional regulatory measures? I worry a lot about the declining purchasing power of what we've known as the middle class in this country in the process. I would argue that the regulatory environment has added to that rather than diminished it. And it is a booming economy trying to keep up with their needs for workers that brings up wages, not governmental decrees that produce it without the absence of productivity. We think we have it bad. Brussels is worse at this point. It is the classic example. The idea of we started that with the European coal and steel community, with the idea that if you integrated their economies, then Germany and France wouldn't go to war again, as they had ever 10 or 15 years, 20 years over a long history. It worked, and that spread to common market and ultimately the European Union. But it's that vast bureaucratic structure put in place in Brussels that is increasingly not only limiting growth inside, but also international interaction with. It's going to be interesting to see how David Cameron makes out. He has climbed on his horse, has his lance to go fight to get them to relax some of Brussels' concern if Britain is going to stay in the European Union, and then to put that whole idea up for a referendum in 2017. And that's going to be pretty scary of how that plays out. I'm not, at this point, the bureaucrats in Brussels will object to any diminishing their growing power, where the leaders of the countries will take a different view. And this is where we will suffer if Mrs. Merkel falls from power, because she's the one leader at this point in time who might be able to bring them together for change to keep them in union. Thank you all very much for your kind time and attention.